Hi everyone, good morning. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Pia and I'm part of the team at Hvar Help, which is the human rights organization that Dusan just mentioned in her video. And I'd really like to start by saying that I'd like to thank the speakers before me, especially you, Farida, wherever you are here on my screen, for your courage and for speaking out about what happened to you and really kind of breaking the silence that often kind of follows sexual violence. I can only imagine how scary that must have felt sometimes. And I think you're a huge inspiration, not only to survivors, but actually to women in general. And I also really enjoyed your book, by the way. And I'd also like to thank IOM Germany and Iraq for inviting me here to speak today on behalf of Hvar Help. Our organization was founded on the ashes of this very genocide in 2015. Our chairwoman, Dusan Teka, who you just saw in the video, she traveled to her ancestral homelands of Sinjar to kind of document what was happening to her people and to other minorities at the hands of ISIS. And she made a documentary film about it. And when she returned, as you can imagine, she was a changed person, and she vowed to kind of dedicate her life to advocating for justice and to making sure that nothing like this can ever happen again to any group or minority. And this is how Hvar Help was born. And today we run kind of multi-ethnic and multi-religious projects in Iraq and Germany. And many of the women that we work with have been living in IDP camps for almost 7 years, which is an issue that Farida also mentioned. And so our teams get to know them very well, and we develop very deep kind of trust-based relationship with these women. What we do is we offer psychotherapy and counseling, literacy and language courses to help these women one day hopefully get a job and build livelihoods and be able to maybe even build their own businesses one day. They also have the opportunity to gain work experience in our so-called Back to Life shop, which is also the name of our project in Iraq, Back to Life. And our therapist, Eileen, always tells us how incredibly driven and strong many of these women are, and how eager they are to kind of learn new skills and move forward with their lives. But she also tells us that they're really, really struggling, some of her patients. They often feel stuck. They feel stuck in these camps. They feel stuck in their minds with these really unbearable memories. And the pain that's caused by these kind of repetitive thought loops that keep revisiting the past can be quite paralyzing, as you might imagine. And many women are also suffering from PTSD, of course, in these cramped living conditions in the camps, which were also mentioned by the previous speakers. And our teams in Iraq and Germany, which are, by the way, composed of Yazidis, Christians, Muslims, and agnostics, we're all mixed as well. We often get pretty frustrated because we see that what these women need are kind of tangible and unbureaucratic interventions, and especially much, much more psychosocial support. The problem is that there just simply isn't enough access to these kinds of services inside or outside of the camps, or even in Germany for that matter, especially during Corona. And the women often tell us, we don't need anti-anxiolytic pills, we don't need antidepressant pills. What we need are jobs and justice and security. And they want to see their kidnappers and rapists and murderers put behind bars. They want to be able to send their kids to school. They want to be able to send their kids to school without having to fear for their lives. They want to live in dignity and build a life outside of the camps one day, which are all pretty normal wishes I think we all take for granted, really. And these women, they often have pretty strong opinions as well, I have to say. And so we think at Hvar they really need to be given a seat at the decision-making table so that they can kind of have a say in the design of these interventions which are meant to help them. And this is why in our projects we spend a lot of time talking with our participants rather than about them, and actually asking them what they need, since they know best. And sometimes we come up with kind of fancy interventions in Germany, and then we pitch these ideas to them, and the women tell us we're crazy and they want something totally different, and we listen. And this is why I'm so glad that IOM is also releasing the study today, because it's really based on interviews with the women themselves and time spent sitting with them and hearing their voices. So when IOM initially invited us to be part of this event, they asked us to speak about the way forward, which isn't easy. And before I talk about the future, I'd like to start by saying that I think the passing of this bill, the so-called Yazidi Survivors Law in March, is a huge milestone. Financial reparations are incredibly important, especially symbolically, because even though the past and the suffering that was endured can obviously never be erased, reparations can give survivors a sense that their pain is finally being recognized and seen by the world, as Jean-Philippe Chaussy also pointed out in his opening remarks. So I think the approval of the bill is something that IOM and the other actors that were involved can be extremely proud of. And it's a huge opportunity for Iraq to set an example for other post-conflict states on how to honor and repair some of the damage that was done to communities, how other states can also do this. If we lead the way in a best practice kind of way. And our team at Hvar are just incredibly grateful for all the efforts. We really know that it can't have been easy. And so the final bill contains a lot of really promising and progressive articles. I'd like to mention just a few that stand out to us. So for example, it has a very wide definition of what sexual violence means, and it covers a wide range of forms, which is great. And it also includes other minorities, this was also mentioned, that were targeted by ISIS, like the Shabaks and the Turkmen and the Christians. And survivors of mass executions, both men and women, as well as Yazidi children who were abducted, also have the right to make claims, as do survivors who live in Iraq, who live outside of Iraq, which is great. And I think at this point it's really important to actually raise awareness of this bill and the fact that it's been passed, and I see that as kind of part of our responsibility here as an international community as well. But having said all this, of course the law is not perfect, which has also been said, even though it's a hugely important step towards redress, of course. But I do think it's important to acknowledge some of the bill's weaknesses, even though they might be sensitive or uncomfortable to speak about. I think that we owe this to the victims to at least mention them. So one of the main weaknesses that we see is that the bill doesn't apply to some of the most vulnerable victims of the conflict, and that's the children born out of sexual violence. Nor does it cover men and boys who suffered sexual violence, which they did. Just ask these women and about their sons and their brothers, and they can tell you. And it also includes survivors from the Kakai and, as far as I understand, the Sunni Arab minorities. And all these victims that kind of fall through the cracks of this bill, they are going to have to be supported through other interventions, like special quota programs, for example. But despite these shortcomings, the most important thing now, I think, when we talk about the way forward is that these promises are actually kept and that the law is actively implemented now that it's been passed. And all of us have a responsibility to ensure that this happens, because it's really at the implementation part that many of these sorts of projects start to stall. And rapid implementation is also crucially important because Yazidis and other minority groups as well have a huge lack of trust in Iraqi institutions, like Gule also pointed out when she presented the study. And this has obviously strong historical roots and is also due to examples in recent history. So actors like IOM and the Coalition for Just Reparations are already working hard behind the scenes to kind of encourage the Iraqi government to do this. And for those of you who don't know, it was also mentioned in the comments, the coalition is a group of about 31, I think, Iraqi civil society organizations who are helping survivors make claims for reparations. And the coalition also worked with UNAMI and IOM to improve the initial draft bill. But what I'm trying to stress here really is that in order to turn this legislation into reality for survivors, we all have to help develop tangible concepts on what implementation will look like, because the information and the specifics about this is still pretty unclear. And this is an opportunity and a responsibility for all of us to work closely with the Iraqi government and the public sector, and to actively promote implementation and keep the spotlight on the Iraqi government. Survivors need to be able to make claims without too much bureaucracy. This is hugely important because it's always a huge barrier, the bureaucracy part. And for this, for example, we need rural field offices to be opened, especially in Sinjar. to support survivors in making their claims and to make them aware that there is this bill where they can actually make a claim. As for Sinjar, this was also touched upon, but the way forward really needs to include a sort of Marshall Plan for the region. So it's really great news that the bill goes beyond just financial compensation. It also recognizes that survivors need much more, like housing, education, jobs, and healthcare and so forth. But in Sinjar, these services are few and far between, and safety is also a huge concern. And this makes it really hard for returnees to satisfy even their basic needs, all returnees. So we need to bring human capacities and expertise and all these kinds of things to the region, as well as basic infrastructure, technical support, transfer of know-how, all these kinds of things. And health centers especially need to be built because, like I said, the need for psychosocial support is huge, not only in Sinjar, but also in the IDP camps in northern Iraq, and as well as in Germany and other receiving countries. And we see this by talking to our participants, of course, but we also see it from the rising suicidality rates, sadly. We keep losing people, and the pandemic hasn't exactly helped because there's even less access to these services during the lockdowns. So whether these reparations and services are provided in Sinjar or elsewhere, they also need to be accompanied, of course, by a culture of remembrance. The bill thankfully legally now recognizes the genocide as such, and it promises memorials and exhibitions, especially around August 3rd. And this is great. It's hugely helpful for the healing process, of course. But what's perhaps the most important aspect for this way forward, apart from all the other things I've mentioned, is what survivors most yearn for, which is legal justice through accountability. And this really needs to be a priority. There are no administrative programs that could ever substitute for justice. And survivors are waiting, and they won't be able to rest before the perpetrators who killed their family members, sometimes before their eyes, or who enslaved them, who violated them, are prosecuted and sentenced. Legal processing is the best immunization for the prevention of future atrocities. And it's incredibly important for the healing process. We hear this again and again from all the women we speak with. And lastly, I'd like to point out that we also have to remain extremely mindful that we don't rest on the fact that this bill has now been passed, or that some reparations will hopefully be paid out soon. Most of these women, as has also been mentioned, are still facing long-term displacement, poverty, persecution, and many are still missing, like Farida also said, to this day. And so the bill can and should only really be seen as the very beginning of a long and probably very challenging road ahead. And we need to make sure that financial reparations are always only one part of a much larger package of services that now need to be implemented, especially psychosocial. But yeah, if we help make all the articles in the bill, if we help these articles to be actually implemented, they do have the potential to make it much easier, or help survivors at least, to heal and rebuild their lives wherever this might be. But for some women, especially those caring for children born of sexual violence, or who've been separated from their children born of sexual violence, there is no future in Iraq. So even with access to reparations and other services stipulated in the bill, they can't return to their communities, which is all they've ever known, as members of a kind of small ethno-religious minority. I think there are less than 1 million Yazidis remaining. And we hope that for these women who can't return, we'll be able to kind of think beyond the bill and find a space for them and their children within kind of future special quota programs or other kinds of programs. Thank you.